So hi everybody, my name's Marie Graham and I'm going to be presenting today, giving my top tips for simplifying complex information. And I just wanted to start by just showing you a little slide. Meaningless jargon spoken here. Among my talents, I can say multivariate, transformative, interactive, analytical, heterogeneity, 3 times very fast. Prioritizing focus-based paradigms with an outcome-driven program, blah, blah. Did we understand any of that? Have you ever read a document or been into a meeting and thought, I really don't understand what's being said or what's going on here? Well, yes, I definitely have. That's me as well. But often in the voluntary sector, it's our job not only to understand this information and to go into unfamiliar environments where we don't always understand the terminology, but also to translate that information into a form where the people that we work with and the communities that we work with can understand, and not only understand, but respond to that information. So the first thing for us is to really look at how can we understand the information first. And we don't have to become experts. I think that's the first thing to say. We only have to understand as much as we need to understand. So the way that I do this is that if I'm receiving complex documents, I'll go through them with a highlighter in hand and pick out the bits that seem important to me, but also the bits that I don't understand. I often find just reading the recommendations or the summary at the beginning really, really useful. But then the other thing that I've learned to do over the years is to ask about anything I don't understand. So ask the author, the distributor, or even other people you know who've received it about any bits of the document that you don't understand. And as members of the collaborative, this is really useful because you've actually got a collective of people here that you can ask. And I'm just going to share a little story. So when I was chief officer of an organisation in Bury, it was a small organisation, and I used to be involved in a lot of strategic level meetings, both at Bury, but also I used to get lots of national information that I had to respond to. And I wasn't always the quickest at absorbing that information. And I didn't always have the time because as a chief officer of a small organisation, you're doing frontline delivery and you're doing everything else. So my go-to person is somebody that some of you will know. And that was John Hannon at GMCVO. And I used to ring him up and go, John, I've received this document. I don't really understand. I'm being asked, do I agree with it or not? Do I? And he would pick out the bits that were important for me, the bits that I should read, and give me some kind of an informed view on what his thoughts were on whatever document that was. And invariably, he had read it, he had understood it, because that's the kind of thing that he enjoys doing. So this is one of the circumstances where if you can find somebody like that, you know, will read all this stuff and digest it, and they can help you with that information. Don't be frightened to ask. In terms of understanding information in meetings, I always, the way I go around this, especially if I know that it is an area that I'm just not that familiar at, I will often look at, I'll always read all the documents in advance. If it's somewhat a meeting I've not been to before, I will take the opportunity to introduce myself to the chair. And that might be in person or it might be by email. And I'll also sometimes remind the chair at this point, I might not be that familiar with some of the jargon and some of the terminology. So if I'm not understanding, can the chair remind the meeting to try and speak in clear English? But also that means if I feel like I need to ask in the meeting, the chair already knows that's something I may be doing. So don't be frightened to ask in a meeting if you don't understand something that you think is important. You don't have to ask about everything. Chances are, if you've not understood it, there are others in the meeting that won't have understood it either. So once you feel you've got a grasp of the information or enough of a grasp, then it's really time to engage your internal translator. And the first thing you want to ask yourself is, who am I simplifying this information for? Who is my audience? What is my community? What is their knowledge level? What are the bits of this information do I want them to understand? And why do I want them to understand it? They might not need to have a whole document translated or the whole content of a meeting translated. It's up to you to pick out the bits that are useful and for you to understand why. And once you've given them this information, what is it that you want them to do with that information? Because at the end of the day, there must be a reason that you're simplifying this complex information for that audience. Is it a consultation that they need to reply to? Is it something they just need to understand because it's important for them or their community? But either way, you need to be clear about why you're simplifying this information for them. Another way you can look at it is, when working out what you want to communicate, is what is that one thing that I want my audience or listeners to remember about my presentation? And that one thing, why should they be concerned about it? Why is it something that's important to them? So if we can simplify it down into a few key bits of information that you really want them to understand, do that. The goal here is to actually make an impact. So you're not only imparting the information, but it's also being received and absorbed, and where necessary, acted on. The next bit is about, how do I communicate this information? And the idea is, what you are all experts in is your audience, your community, your people. Knowing what their existing knowledge level is, and it will be different, just like the people in this meeting are different. Knowing what that their prior knowledge is important, but also knowing which is the best way of communicating to that audience. So it could be in a group meeting or events, and that could be face-to-face or on Zoom. So it's you presenting that information. It could be you preparing a document that is sent out to people via email or by post even. Or perhaps doing a little video or film clip to bring it to life. What works best? And if it's really important that this information is communicated, or really important we get a response, you might actually want to consider multiple methods of communication. The next question I really ask myself is, how far do I simplify this information? And this is a question of balancing. How simple can you make it, and how simple does it have to be? And the reason you've got a lovely picture of a TV remote control here is because I'm going to use that to illustrate a point. So if you look at this remote control, you can see that it's got lots and lots of different buttons doing lots of different things. Some of them are labeled and some of them aren't. And as TV remote controls are my nemesis, and I find them incredibly difficult to work out, especially when the gadgets in our house keep changing and we get new remote controls, I actually only want to know what the buttons are that are useful to me. So the simplest form of a remote control would be an on-off button. Yeah, so you could simplify information right down to a yes/no question. But then you would need to ask yourself, is how useful would that be? Well, in terms of a remote control, not that useful. What I'd want to know, I want is the buttons for the channels. That's really useful for me. But would that be enough? Well, actually, 90% of the time, that wouldn't be enough for me if I've just got the channels and an on-off and I'm happy. But then to add to that, perhaps I could do with a volume. Perhaps I could do with the mute button. But do I need the buttons that show me how to change the source, how to zoom, how to look at text, how to get subtitles on? Perhaps I do, perhaps I don't. But this is a question for you to work out how much information is enough. Too simple and people won't have the information they need to take the action you want them to. Too much information, it becomes too complex to understand for people. So I recommend next a staged process. Gathering the relevant information. So going through a document, going through a meeting notes, and leaving out anything that you don't need. It can be tempting to share every detail, but it's important to remember that your audience may not need or want all that information. And in fact, if you provide too much detail, it can really muddle your message. Distill down to its smallest parts. What are the main components of what you are sharing? Break that information down into easy chunks. And ask yourself questions from the layperson's point of view. Would I understand this? How far do I need this broken down? Are there any holes in the information that I'm giving that could confuse a non-expert? And then when presenting this information, it's about organizing that information. So if all the information I put on these slides was just presented in one chunk as a kind of piece of prose, it would be quite difficult for you to read and quite difficult for people to understand. But by putting it in the form of headings with bullet points, it helps organize the information for people. The other thing around that, it's also about perhaps using some clear and succinct language. So making sure that when we're presenting back, we're not accidentally using jargon that we may have picked up along the way. Or if we do use jargon, because sometimes jargon and acronyms are useful, at least making sure we explain them and those explanations are easily accessible for people. Making sure that you use simpler language, and especially if you're working with people where English, if you're not going to translate it and you're working with people where English isn't their first language, make sure that it is phrased simply with short sentences and with clear and simple words. Is this clear? Is this easy for people to understand? Putting in little stories is always useful in order to create clarity for people's understanding. And part of this is this idea about using formatting to your advantage. So you don't want to overclutter the information that you're giving people, but you do want to format in a way that makes it attractive and easy to understand. And with this, I always think about people that may have visual impairments as well, that may be dyslexic. So making sure that the way that you're presenting is really clear. So in some, you see, I've used this particular PowerPoint presentation. It's a template that we use for the leadership group. But actually, white background with black writing is not great for some people who are dyslexic. However, what we have used is fairly large fonts, and we haven't put too much information on one page. So it's easy for people to actually read. So it's not just about the information that you put there, it's actually about how it's presented. And the last part of my staging in this is get someone to check what you've written. And if you can possibly get somebody who's from your audience to read it, that's even better. Someone without prior knowledge, someone without having been at the meeting or read the full document, getting them to check what you've written or you're about to present to make sure that it is understandable, that it is, that they can follow it, that they come away feeling that they've learnt something from it. A couple of points on actual presentation structure. And I often do this when I'm doing talks or I'm writing, or even when I do an email. The first thing that I do is tell people what I'm presenting and why I'm presenting it. Yeah. So if you go back to the beginning of this presentation and the very first slide that I showed people, was very much sort of saying, have you ever been into a meeting where you haven't understood what was going on, where it was meaningless for you? And then I went into saying, but however, sometimes we have to go into those meetings and not only understand, we then have to simplify the information so we can help other people to understand. So I was explaining what this presentation was about and why it's relevant to you as an audience. And that's a good habit to get into whenever you're presenting information back, whether it's in writing or in person. And putting in there, if you have an ask of people, letting them know at the beginning what that ask is. So if you're presenting information because you want a response, you could say, I want to tell you about this information. I got it at a meeting. It's very important. And actually, they want to know what people with lived experience think. So could you have a think about the information as I'm presenting it? And then you can start giving me some feedback at the end. So they know at the beginning what you're wanting them to do. Then present that information and summarize it, and then repeat the question to the audience at the end. Always encouraging questions and discussions and making sure that people know it's okay to ask if they don't understand what you're saying. Perhaps saying to people at the beginning, if I slip into any jargon, please can you let me know? If there's anything I say that you don't understand, please tell me. So people have that, know that that is okay to do. Use of pictures is really important. And a picture can say a million words, which is why I put a little picture up here. And this was just probably a little picture that summarizes some of the stuff that I've said. So a simple question, cut away clutter, write and rewrite. I didn't say that actually, but it's in my picture, and organize. But it can be a really, really simple and clear way to express an idea or to illustrate complex information. Sometimes a little flow chart works for people as well. Specifically when we are working with people where English may not be their first language, or they may not have great levels of literacy, then pictures can be really, really useful. And I know that there is a specific picture library that is useful when working with people with learning disabilities that can be used to translate written information into picture form, or you can have pictures alongside written information to help people understand what that written information is. But yes, use pictures. They can also really good for making an impact and really bringing something to life. I have a couple of resources here that I've put up here, and one of them is around the Plain English campaign. And the Plain English campaign used to be a fully funded organisation and used to be able to send documents off to them, and they would kind of translate them into clear and plain English for people. And you could also at one point get a free kind of plain English kite mark for documents. Now, that was in the days when they were a fully funded organisation, but I went onto their website earlier on today and I realised that's no longer the case, that a lot of what they do now they charge for. But what they do have is a number of really, really useful free guides, which I do think are incredibly useful for people. And they help you with things like explaining things in a way that is simple for people to understand. And there's just loads and loads of little tips and guidance in there. I also came across this site, which is around using pictures to explain things. And it gave lots of information about how you can, about the kinds of pictures you can use, where you can get them from, that can help illustrate a point that you may want to make when you're making presentations, or in terms of simplifying down complex information. But I am aware that there are loads and loads of other resources such as this. So what I'm actually planning to do next is I'm actually going to be asking the people here in this meeting, do you know of any resources? And if so, you can either put them in the chat or you can email them into Kat. Because what I'd like to do is to build up a little resource sheet for members of the collaborative where they can have a list of resources that will help them with different aspects of different aspects of making information accessible. So, or better just put reading age calculator, she's going to find a link as well. There were other links for people who might have visual impairments. There are other links for people who may have be dyslexic, for example. So we can have a little bit of a resource for people. So just to recap, and I'm just going to stop sharing for a second. And I'm going to go, and I am going to reshare, but what I am going to do is just go back to the presentation, and I'm going to just go back to the very first the first slide that I showed. So what we want to ensure when we're presenting our information to the communities that we work with is that nobody comes away feeling like this. That not only are we going into meetings and understanding what's going on, but then when we simplify and present that information back to communities, that nobody's going away thinking meaningless jargon spoken here. No one's going away thinking that you're speaking in kind of management speak gobbledygook. And what I'd really like you to do now is to go forth, simplify and liberate that information for your communities so they can play a meaningful part in engagement, especially in the strategic policy and decision making that we're all involved in.